What has been the effect of coercion, asked Thomas Jefferson? To make one half of the world fools and the other half hypocrites, to support roguery and error all over the earth. Now, I'm not looking to force you to do anything except to tune in, because I'm Rav Mike Foyer, and this is The Jewish Story. Interlude, Religion and State. In the summer of 1947, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, that's UNSCOP, those of you who don't know, started a fact-finding tour through the Palestine Mandate. Now, we're going to tell the whole story of the UN, UNSCOP, the mandate. Don't be nervous if you don't know it. But for our purposes, what you need to know is that on the table was nothing less than international recognition of a state for the Jewish people within the land of Israel. But one of the preconditions the UN had given for the establishment of this Jewish state was freedom of speech to all of its citizens. That might sound obvious to you if you happen to be a liberal Westerner out there, but is not a given for the world as a whole, certainly not in 1947. And so, David Ben-Gurion, then head of the Jewish Agency Executive, soon to be the first prime minister, sent a letter to the ultra-Orthodox party Agudat Yisrael in order to form a united policy to present to the committee. And that letter detailed 4 principles that serve as the basis to this very day to what is known as the Status Quo Agreement, an informal but very powerful understanding that rules the relationship of the state to religion, sometimes with an iron fist, as we will see. In brief, the 4 points are: Shabbat, the Jewish day of rest, will rule in the state of Israel, not necessarily in all of its manifestations, but we don't rest on Sunday here, we work. Be warned, by the way, if you're thinking of making Aliyah. Number 2, Kashrut, the dietary laws of Judaism, that the kitchens in the Jewish state's official institutions will abide by those laws. Number 3, and perhaps most significantly for our conversation today, family law, that a single judicial system would be preserved for the purpose of marriage and divorce, conducted by rabbinical courts for Jews and the relevant religious authorities for people of other faiths. If you don't know, there is no such thing as civil marriage in the state of Israel. And last, but not least, close to my heart, education, that full autonomy within certain curricular requirements would be granted to different Jewish denominations. Now, in the light of our story, I want you to think about the fact that the relationship between religion and state is a testing ground of sovereign power. And if you've been listening for a while, you'll know that for the Jews, that relationship poses particular challenges. And sometimes, in my experience, questions of such magnitude should not be considered alone. And so, I have with me today Rav Aaron Leibowitz, community rabbi in the Nachlaot neighborhood of Jerusalem, founder of Hashgacha Pratit, the organization which single-handedly broke the monopoly of the Rabbanut over kashrut in Israel, and is now moving that organization on to the challenge of weddings. Oh, and I should add, just for full disclosure's sake, he is my Rebbe. We worked together for many years at Sulm Yaakov. Many of you have heard of it. Perhaps some of you have been there. And so I have with me here today Rav Aaron. Shalom, Rav Aaron. It's been a long time since we sat.
It has. It's so good to be here with you again, Rav Mike.
Sometimes I listen to our voices together when I get nostalgic back there on Rabbis Out of the Box. How are you doing? What's happening?
I'm good. Life is very interesting.
Well, I read about you in the papers. It's not like I don't know what's going on.
Well, there's a lot that's in the papers and there's a lot that's behind the scenes. And,
well, I'm curious about both. Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, what you do, how you came to do that, social activism, community leader, rabbi.
Well, I mean, without giving my whole biography, I could speak about how parts of this were born in my childhood in Berkeley, California, but it wasn't really until my 40s that the Berkeley came out, and that's more relevant.
They say, by the way, you have to be careful because they always comes out. The Californian people always comes out.
Yeah. So it was really in the summer of 2011 where conversations which I'd been having for all of my young adult life with secular Israelis, my experiences in high school with friends who were Orthodox and became secular, and being privy and part of the conversations which led to that, and then really connecting to a group of young Jerusalemite activists who were characterized by diversity of thought and diversity of lifestyle, and a really, really very compelling community which had formed itself to contain different halachic identities within one community, and a community which viewed itself as a change agent for the city and for the country, and in the context of that group, who are called Yerushalmim and founded by a now member of Knesset and Jerusalem mayoral candidate Rachel Azaria.
Yeah, she's in that crowded race right now, huh?
Yes.
Give us odds. Can we give us odds real quick?
Give odds for Rachel. Boy, it's the map is still changing almost daily, and I wouldn't be supporting her if I didn't think she had a chance.
There you go. And plus, the Charedim are defacing her signs, so that's raising her odds.
Absolutely.
Sorry, we'll go back to the main topic.
It's to the point that she's being accused of orchestrating it.
Oh, really? I hadn't heard that. Oh, I love it. Oh, you got to love today's media.
Yeah, and it also that's very relevant to our conversation.
Absolutely.
One of her hallmark issues was the inclusion of women in the public space.
Or we should say rather the fear of their exclusion, which was what's going on.
That's right, battling the trend of exclusion. We just had a conversation in our community yesterday about the fact that at the Bnei Akiva camp, apparently at the canteen, they created separate lines for the boys and the girls this year.
Really?
Yes.
I'll have to ask my daughter about that. But it's Sayarot? Where?
I'm not.
We can talk about it later. Sorry, our listeners don't need to.
My kids are in Ariel, so I'm on the right hand.
I was going to say, wow, you that's a given for you. So
But that conversation is a huge conversation, and it's in the context of that particular group that I discovered that the monopoly of the chief rabbinate on kosher food was actually detrimental to everybody's interests. In other words, on the one hand, it was corrupt and therefore hurting the business owners. It was unreliable and therefore it was hurting the kosher observant community. And it was representative and symbolic of a monopoly of the rabbinut on religious services, and therefore an issue for the secular community. So we discovered that here was an issue which was tailor-made for us because all parties could get around it, or at least the moderate voices in all parties could join together. If you have an extreme left-wing position, they want nothing to do with kosher food.
Right.
And if you have an extreme right-wing position, then they're not eating the rabbanut food anyway,
right.
And for them it's just a political goal to maintain control. But being able to bring together all the moderate voices of people who are traditional or simply looking for coexistence and the common good, and people who feel that
or
corruption
in business.
That's right. People feel that corruption should be battled. Not only the oppositional ideologies, but let's battle corruption.
Let's talk about bad behavior for a minute.
That's right. So we kind of started off on a grassroots level with only 2 or 3 restaurants, and within 5 years it was over 40 restaurants in 5 cities in Israel.
It's been a meteoric rise,
and it was really exciting. It was bittersweet. On the eve of this last Passover, that we made the first exit in religion and state in Israel, and we passed our entire system over to Tzohar, which is the largest modern Orthodox rabbinic organization in Israel. Very strong brand, national presence, in all regions of the country. And they took over our system and are taking it to the next level. I say bittersweet. My daughter said, Abba, it's like marrying off a child.
Sure, you hope she thrives.
That's right. That's right.
And maybe we'll come back to it. I would note, because probably our listeners aren't aware, Tzohar's stance has historically been making change from within. Whereas the posture that you chose, or were called to, however you want to think of it, with Hashgacha Pratit, was specifically making change from without.
I think the model is first of all creating competition, creating alternatives, building a mass civilian movement around the alternatives, and then what happens is when you look at the political arena, or even when you look at an organization like Tzohar, they can't. Politicians and other organizations can't afford to ignore the public. In other words, once the demand is there and it's needed, they run the risk of becoming irrelevant or less than relevant if they continue to ignore that call.
That's something that our detractors should remember, that we are a thriving democracy, and with all the warts and bumps, it means that in the end of the day, if you want change badly enough and you're able to organize, you can make it happen.
Yeah, most definitely. I would say that if somebody coming to visit Israel, or somebody reading who generally gets their impressions from the press, which are focused on the legislative arm or the judicial arm,
and have a bit of the evil eye, they tend to see the bad.
Well, they tend to see the bad, as does the press.
That's what I'm saying. The press. That's my point.
That's right. But one of the most exciting things that are happening in Israel is the grassroots civil society,
yes.
Level, And really, again, the change that happens there, nobody can afford to ignore it once it's actually taking place and happening. And the biggest proof is the kashrut. Tzohar saw an opportunity, realized that they were going to become less than relevant unless they took this opportunity, and they stepped up to the plate. And we believe, really, this is our theory of change, which we can speak about more later on, that the same thing will happen with weddings.
So this is worth it for me to think about, actually, in the long run of our story. I won't drag you all the way into it, but what I hear you saying to some degree is that sovereign power within the state resides within the people, as is the theory of democratic principle, right? Of the people, by the people, for the people. We grew up in America, or you did to a young age, right? And yet, it's not a given within the history of the state of Israel that democratic principles drive our country. Not even, I'm not being cynical or conspiracy oriented, but Ben Gurion and the Mapai, the political parties that built the state from the beginning, were socialist. I mean, it's noteworthy, as much as we have all these battles in the Supreme Court, and we'll draw them into our conversation eventually, that the Supreme Court loves to adjudicate between the Jewish and democratic nature of our country. And yet, if you look into the Declaration of Independence, with all the guarantees it gives for equality of citizenship, the word democracy is not there.
Yeah, well, I think that first of all, socialism and democracy are in tension, but aren't necessary, but aren't opposites. In other words, the question of capitalism versus socialism is an important balance that Israel, I think, actually does an amazing job of holding,
You can get a lot of consumer goods, but still wait in lines.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, recently I just went through a whole slew of medical checks. Thank God, everything's good. And just medicine in this country. You watch what's going on in the United States, and it's a wonder. Medicine in this country is a wonder. Yep. And
you may have to wait in line, but you won't pay an arm and leg for it, and it will happen well.
That's right. And I may have waited 3 weeks for a test, which under like high end, well-funded private medicine would have happened within a day, and that was a frustration.
Right.
And yet, when I thought about whether I could have afforded it otherwise, it was a clear win.
And Jewish doctors.
Well,
not all of them.
Actually, the experience in hospitals in Israel is one of the strongest experiences of coexistence that there possibly are, because the equalizer of health, and it really brings out the simple humanity, both in the medical teams and in the patients.
More so even than the army, because there's a segment of our population too that don't participate there. But in the hospital, on some level, we're all human.
That's right. Now, in terms of being a democracy, I think Israel is most definitely a democracy. Some might question whether it's a strong liberal democracy. In other words, what are the mitigating values? And I feel like that really does come out in the Supreme Court. By the way, the Supreme Court is not always happy with the fact that Israeli law gives the chief rabbinate of Israel the authority to define what is Jewish, what is Judaism, and what is not.
I think that's a gross understatement that they're not always happy.
So it becomes very clear in many of their rulings. And by the way, the Supreme Court is one of the weakest arenas for religion and state, for people who are looking for more flexibility in religion and state. Because Israeli law makes it very clear that the chief rabbinate are the arbiters of what is Jewish and what is not, what is halachic and what is not.
So the law ties the hands of the court.
So the Supreme Court will only intervene in cases where it feels that core human rights are unconsciously being compromised. In other words, I would say it's only in the extreme cases, which is why when it comes to religion and state, I would say that the liberal side wins maybe one out of 5 cases. And,
wow.
So
that's funny, because it's not, depending on what press you read, it looks like there's a crisis, and that the court is an activist court. But what I hear you saying is it may be in other realms, but not in this.
Well, I mean, from the perspective of those who are trying to hold on to the monopoly, so 1 out of 5
is a big loss.
Each one of those, and remember that a fundamentalist or black and white worldview, every loss is the end of the world.
Yes, this is true.
There's very little room for compromise. So a good example is the 2 times the Supreme Court heard our case on kashrut, and the court really was weighing the what it viewed as the interest of the consumer, of the kosher consumer, to know that their food is kosher. The mandated authority to say what's required for the consumer to be able to become was the chief rabbinate. the corrupt element or the irony was that the chief rabbinate had a financial interest in
Right.
maintaining that monopoly.
Big business.
And it went against the financial interest of the business owner, who the business owner and the public at large might have had an interest in a competitive market.
Well, for sure. I mean, any cost to a business owner is a cost to the consumer.
That's right. And yet the court ruled against us both times. In other words,
Because the law was clear.
because the law was because there was the chief rabbinate is a mandated authority to give an authoritative opinion over what is required for food to be reliably kosher.
So, I mean, food is big business, and definitely we all love to eat, and it's an important right of the consumer to have competition. But, the developments that I want to move to now, I think touch a little closer to home. Several weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks at this point, Rabbi Dov Hayun, a representative of the conservative movement here, or what's called the Tnuat Masorati in Israel, was woken up from his home at 5 a.m. by the Israeli police, arrested, he was not charged. He was taken into custody by the police and interrogated about the alleged fact that he was performing weddings outside of the auspices of the Rabbanut. Because, of course, in addition to the monopoly on kashrut that the Rabbanut holds, legally mandated, as you point out, there's also a legally mandated monopoly on weddings. And that may sound absolutely bizarre to some of our listeners who can't imagine a democracy in which a rabbi, or a clergyman of any faith, would be arrested by the civil authorities and interrogated. Did she give him the ring, or did he give her the ring? We must know, Rabbi. And yet I'm not privy to the details of the conversation. I don't know if they actually got that far. But this shook a good part of not just the liberal world. I think that in the community I live in, there were a lot of questions that were raised about where have we gone in the relationship between religious authority and state power. And I use this as a segue because you've moved on from kashrut. I mean, like you said, you made the exit. You married off the child, thank God, successfully, and she should be healthy and well. And now, what lies ahead?
So, we've been chafing at the bit to go into weddings for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason we had been holding back is because we know that the issues that are on the table, the halachic issues and the social issues that are on the table in weddings are much heavier. The stakes are higher.
Oh, sure.
And we were very concerned that if we did something which was more radical, we would alienate some of the mainstream people who had chosen to support our move in kashrut.
Mm-hmm.
So when we were able a few months ago to pass on the kashrut, we had already been over the course of a year been building a model for weddings outside the Rabbanut. And I want to make clear that our model is for performing wedding ceremonies. The project is called Chupot. The official name is Chupot, from the people who brought you Hashgacha Pratit.
Uh-huh.
And
Chupot, for our listeners who don't know, the chuppah is the wedding canopy in Hebrew.
Right, and it relates to legislation, and it relates to legislation which goes back, really to Ottoman law, which defines, what the law in Israel does is it defines that somebody who gets married must register, and must get married with an official registrar. But what the amendment, which was amended into law about 4 years ago, is an amendment which defines the requirement for a couple and the rabbi who performed the wedding to register with the chief rabbinate, and if they do not register with the chief rabbinate, it's punishable by 2 years in prison.
For the couple as well as the rabbi?
For the couple as well as the rabbi.
That'd be quite a honeymoon, huh?
So now the interesting fact is that there's a very clear consensus that the law is poorly written and therefore hardly enforceable. And not to mention the fact that most prominent legal opinions are that the Supreme Court would overturn any attempt to throw someone in. In other words, when I said before that there are cases, when something is unconscionable,
mm-hmm.
and I do believe that the Supreme Court would likely view that as unconscionable, as to throw a rabbi and a couple in prison for getting married in accordance with their faith and conscience.
Sounds problematic.
So nobody really believes that this will ever take place, and nonetheless, it's been very effective in creating a deterrent.
Oh yes, I've seen it amongst my peers.
That's right. So people are scared. I feel like part of our role, and this is part of what we did in Kashrut also, is to disempower the boogeyman.
It's to be the nachshon, right? This idea that if you jump into the water first, that things will part. Things are going to happen.
And also a lot of, so much of where society is stuck today is fear-based. And so many of our fears come from our imagination and are not there. Although it has to be said that when we're talking about weddings, there are reasonable fears.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about those fears, because I know, in particular, there's one gentleman in my neighborhood who's a very strong advocate and member of the Rabbanut, who I've had many Park Shabbat conversations with about the work that you do, because he knows that we're associated, as well as I haven't mentioned to him, I didn't mention before you guys went public, the wedding project, but I knew it was on the horizon. And he's afraid. He's afraid of many things. I'm curious how you see it. What is there to be afraid of, legitimate or not?
First of all, the fears that people raise regarding this particular project are legitimate. Okay, and one of them is regarding illegitimacy of children.
Right.
And if we're talking about a couple that get married and they get married according to halakha, then certainly anyone who prescribes to halakha will be concerned for the eventuality that a certain percentage, and a not small percentage, of those weddings will eventually end. And when the couple chooses to separate, will they pursue a get? Will they responsibly pursue a halachic divorce? Because the concern, if they do not pursue a divorce, is that any subsequent children that the woman might have with other men would be mamzerim, would be what's often translated as bastard, but really
it does an inaccuracy in English and Hebrew there.
That's right. In terms of how you understand it, it's not children born out of wedlock; it's illegitimate children born to a married woman.
Right.
So. And the severity of that status is such that they are unmarriageable, and all of their descendants are unmarriageable.
It's an inherited status,
except in exclusive cases. For instance, a male and a woman, mamzer, may marry one another.
Right.
But their children will also be mamzerim. It's one of the greatest rabbinic concerns, and also one of the more creative areas of halakha in terms of finding ways to remove that status from people who otherwise might have had it.
To our liberal Jewish listeners, it's important that the notion of tikkun olam, of fixing the world, in the rabbinic mind is often associated with avoiding situations of mamzerut.
Yes.
Right? They were willing to take, as you say, creative and often ridiculously bold action in order to avoid an unfixable situation.
Correct. So that definitely is one of the concerns, because, and why would that be a concern? Because somebody who gets married with the chief rabbin in Israel and therefore is registered as married cannot
remarry.
Cannot remarry, and also cannot divorce without going through that stop of the rabbinic court. In other words,
just as there is no civil marriage, there is no civil divorce.
That's right. So the state of Israel will not recognize the divorce unless it's authorized by the Beit Din of the chief rabbin of Israel, which means that there's a relatively available sanction for couples and way to enforce them getting divorced. Now,
there's control.
Now the problem is. And I'd say this is a huge concern, is that the rabbinic courts are I'm looking for a word.
Take a minute.
How do you say aflaya?
They've overstepped their bounds.
No. They I got it.
Yeah.
The problem is that the rabbinic courts discriminate against women.
Oh, yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So the rabbinic courts discriminate against women. Orthodox halakha, was written and encoded in a different time of history, and certainly the Torah, is very clear that there is no fault divorce. There is one-sided no fault divorce in Judaism.
Sure, it was a rabbinic innovation that you needed a woman's consent for divorce.
Correct. And so despite the fact that over the years there have been many corrective measures in the halakha to protect women and to enforce women, whether
God bless the rabbis,
whether it's ketubah or whether it's the fact that a woman has to consent for divorce, and despite the fact that that today the challenge of refusing a divorce, there are cases also where men are stuck because the woman refuses.
I have a friend who suffered in that situation for a number of years.
Right, and that's a result of rabbinic decrees that were instated to to level the playing field and
equalize power.
To equalize power. And yet, in the rabbinic court and in ultra-Orthodox communities, the power is not equalized. It's still very much works in the man's favor.
I just want to map that for a second because I hear a couple of things. We have a question of power between the rabbinate and secular society, as embodied in the state, which the state has sort of bowed, so to speak, to the power of religion here in this particular family law. We have the power within religious community, which rabbi gets to say what, and then we have the power between men and women. Right, which all of these, sort of the intersection, to borrow a term from our friends on the left, of so many dynamics of power lends itself to suffering.
Yes, and extreme suffering. I mean, people who follow the news are familiar with cases of women who have been imprisoned in a marriage and unable to marry for over a decade as a result of get refusal. Those are extreme cases. The more normal cases, I would say, perhaps even get refusal is a misnomer, because it might more accurately be called get leverage.
Sure.
Usually, what happens is the man takes advantage of the fact that the woman cannot remarry, and that's where there still is a huge lack of balance of power. In other words, even though you need the woman's consent for a divorce document as well as the man's, if a man remarries, despite the fact that he hasn't received a divorce document, it does not have ramifications for his children.
It's still a legitimate marriage.
That's right. So therefore, he has the upper hand, and because the rabbinic courts have not taken measures, from my perspective, and from many Orthodox rabbis' perspectives, and from many Orthodox people and women's perspectives, has not taken sufficient measures to empower women and protect women in that environment. So it's not clear cut. In other words, one would say that registering with the Rabbanut creates a safer situation regarding the possibility of couples who would separate without a divorce. The problem is it creates a significantly less secure situation for women who want an equitable divorce process.
Mm-hmm.
And
how is your initiative going to address that through marriage?
So I would say, first of all, a couple who are not registered with the chief rabbinate are not required to go to an Orthodox rabbinic court. In other words, they can divorce anywhere they want. Mm-hmm. The concern then remains, will they perhaps not divorce? Will they perhaps choose not to divorce? So that really touches upon not only mamzerut, it touches upon get refusal, it touches upon the possibility of agunot, and by the way, also touches upon the need, if you're getting married outside the chief rabbinate, to protect the couple against bigamy. In other words, if somebody would be registered with the state, it would be much more difficult for them to get married again if they were already married. So those are really the issues that have to be addressed.
Those are the fears, as we said.
Now, one of the reasons that we're passionate about the work that we're doing is that we feel that we're not only addressing each of those issues, but that the methods which we're using to address those issues are preferable and safer than the methods that are at the Rabbanut's disposal.
Within the halachic system.
Within the halachic system and within the and within the legal system,
within the civil legal
of Israel. Okay, I'll just give a quick outline of those measures. All of the things that we employ have to do with documents that the couple sign before they get married. Mm-hmm. I would say the first level is the couple are required to present documentation, of their governmental identification to clarify that they're both single, and also to be able to check into their Jewish status. And we can speak more at length about the Jewish status later on. That's another.
But those are standards both within Jewish law and civil law, anyway.
Correct. Then the couple are required to sign an agreement between our organization and the couple, and in that agreement, they first of all declare that they are unmarried, in case there is perhaps unregistered marriage somewhere in the past. Sure. They declare, and with legal sanctions, it's a legally binding declaration, and they also declare and commit to us that they will arrange for a get, for a halachic divorce, in the case
eventuality
that they separate. In addition to that legal document, which also has sanctions, they sign another agreement between themselves. Okay, and then this is what is very commonly known as a halachic prenup. And today is required, for instance, by the RCA, by the American Orthodox Rabbinical Association. It's required, it's recommended by Tzohar, which perform today 40% of the weddings in Israel.
Oh, wow. So you're cutting into another Zohar project here.
Yes and no, because all the weddings that Zohar performs are Rabbanut weddings. In other words,
they're 40% within the system.
That's right. In other words, what Zohar provide is a more positive interaction, a user interface,
User-friendly,
UI.
right.
But ultimately, you're getting married with the chief rabbinate, and anyone who would not be eligible for marriage with the chief rabbinate cannot get married with Zohar. For instance, I'll mention that one of the first interactions we had with Zohar was they were deciding whether they could allow couples to get married with caterers from our kashrut, because the Rabbanut require that your wedding be in a kosher wedding hall.
Really?
Despite the fact that it's totally irrelevant to the wedding itself.
Correct.
And despite the fact that it creates a total experience of strong arming on the part of
because there's a direct financial
community.
Relationship between the Rabbanut and the kashrut system.
And when Zohar contacted us, they said, we hate this. We don't believe in it, but we have to hold that standard as well, because we're required to follow all the standards of the Rabbanut.
Sure.
So someone who gets married with Zohar is being registered with the Rabbanut, but Zohar also recommend a halachic prenup. In short, what a halachic prenup does is it gives a couple a year to arrange for an agreeable divorce, and if at the end of that year there's still a couple refusing to grant, or one of the couples chooses to refuse to grant a get, they began to pay a monthly financial penalty. So what this document does is it creates an incentive to reach an amenable agreement within a given amount of time. And this has already been, these kinds of documents have been employed already for close to 2 decades and are proven effective.
Yeah, they've been tested in the courts. You've seen it. It is working.
Tested in the courts, and we know of no case of significant get leverage of couples who have signed these documents, and that's been proven in different countries. So that also addresses many of the concerns. And then, on top of all of those measures, which really are sufficient to prevent bigamy, to prevent somebody not getting a get, to prevent get refusal, to prevent agunot. In addition to all,
I would add to that intermarriage, which is a major fear of people out there in Israel today.
Well, the issue of intermarriage is a whole other playing field, and that's something which is worth discussing, because it has a lot to do with the chief rabbinate's desire to also control conversion.
What do you mean?
Well, the legislation at this point does not grant the chief rabbinate a monopoly on conversion.
Right, that's a swirling issue right now.
That's right.
In the
so
Knesset.
you can open a private conversion court and perform Orthodox conversions in Israel. They won't be recognized by the state.
As if some of my students have done. It's a terribly painful situation to have rabbis who are big rabbis. In fact, one who was the head of the rabbinic institution of conversion, who eventually opened his own conversion court, and to not be recognized by the Rabbanut.
Correct.
That's a discussion for another time, the who is a Jew thing. We should get back together on that one. We've had it once.
Right. Although it's important to note that to not be recognized by the state is primarily significant when you choose to get married.
Right.
And that's why our project
it relates directly to the question
to conversion. In other words,
I hadn't thought about that.
People who convert in unrecognized courts will now have an address where they can get married, where all of their concerns of get refusal, of agunot, of mamzerut, of bigamy, where all of those concerns will be addressed in a preferable manner to whatever the rabbinut would have had to offer. And then really the last and additional line of defense which we employ, which is relatively radical halachically, but has been approved by halachic giants who we've consulted with, is couples who get married with us also get married conditionally. We use what's called the Tanai B'Kiddushin. And this condition is for, I would say it's a doomsday device, which would allow for a unilateral divorce on the part of one. Well,
it's an annulment in that sense.
Of one party. It gives the authority to a religious court, not to the couple themselves. It gives the authority to a Beit Din to annul the marriage retroactively.
Right. Just clearing, it's not a divorce. Actually.
In the eventuality that a couple have not lived together as husband and wife for a year and a half, and one of the members of the couple petitioned the Beit Din can then investigate, determine that for all intents and purposes they have ended their relationship, and retroactively annul the marriage in order to free the woman to remarry and not cause mamzerut.
That's the one that's going to cause the bombshell with the other rabbis out there when it comes out.
Well, I mean, first of all, our expectation is that there will be next to no cases where this will have to be employed. So I would say, so that's number one. Second of all, we've had in the last 2 months 2 cases where a rabbinic court have annulled a marriage without such an agreement, without such a retroactive
One of whom we
agreement.
know who it was, and the other one we don't.
Yes. So there certainly is precedent, and one of the interesting things is that both of those events took place with very little pushback.
Mm-hmm.
With very little. I mean, there was public pushback.
Yeah, I was surprised at how little.
But it was relatively moderate because the bottom line is that there is a strong halachic basis, especially in a case where there is no other recourse to employ these types of solutions.
Yes.
So despite the fact that they're not practiced, it's very hard to challenge them on strong halachic grounds, other than it hasn't been done or historically it wasn't accepted. But the opinions that hold it that isn't valid halachically they are the minority.
Right.
So ultimately we're talking about an alternative which is viable, an alternative which is safe, an alternative which is healthy, an alternative which we can very strongly allay any fears that people have. We know it's going to take a few years for that to sink in, and
sure.
that's really our theory of change, is that this is these are things that Zohar, for instance, should have and could have chosen to do, and we believe that one of the reasons that modern Orthodox rabbis in Israel, the more prominent modern Orthodox rabbis, because it must be said that I am not a halachic heavyweight, and although I do consult with halachic heavyweights, and I would not make a step if I did not have somebody who I saw as a halachic heavyweight tell me, who I and others saw as a halachic heavyweight, tell me that it's mutar. But why are halachic heavyweights not stepping out on a limb? Because they have a lot to lose and very little to gain. Our role, and this goes to our theory of change, is to create a situation where they have a lot to lose by not going out on a limb,
mm-hmm.
a lot to lose in terms of the public identification, in terms of being perceived popularly as the leadership that the populace are hoping for.
So what I hear you saying is that you're creating a community of interest around issues right now where power remains in the hands of an elite, in this case, a rabbinic elite, but it can be a political elite as well, because as we've heard already, one of the themes running through this conversation is the fact that religious power and civil power don't have a clear differentiation within our state. And by creating a community of interest, you allow authorities who, I mean, with all due respect, we all protect our power base and our interests, who can then essentially endorse change by stepping into a new leadership role with a new community.
I wouldn't even say it's a new community. You take an organization like Zohar; they perceive themselves as being the leadership of the modern Orthodox.
So you're giving a new voice to the religious community they're already leading.
As the religious Zionist community begin to shift left, our assessment is that Zohar will not be able to afford not to shift left with them.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, one of the things that makes it possible for Zohar to make that shift left is that there's another organization challenging them from the left wing.
Sure.
So they no longer are perceived as being the breakers of the status quo, which is, of course, a concept which you began with.
Right.
And it's worth exploring this idea of the status quo because actually it's in many ways it's a misleading term.
So I actually want to end on that note. I mean, you've given us a tremendous lot to think about here in the particular battleground of social change as a concept. Also in the issues which exist in personal status as they intersect with sort of civil and religious power. I want to ask you, in your eyes, like I said, the big picture. You can speak about the status quo, or you can speak about your own vision. First of all, should there be a separation of religion and state in our modern state? I mean, our American listeners, like myself, grew up in a world in which that was a given, that religion and state never the two shall meet. And they're often surprised. Even American religious Jews are sometimes surprised when they move to the state of Israel and they discover that there's no such division enshrined in law, and certainly not in practice. What's your vision?
So first of all, one of the most formative quotes for me in this particular area is of the Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who wrote that religion becomes weaker the more it tries to garner power. And the more religion is able to release power, the stronger it becomes. I mean, I think this is a very true and deep statement, and I think it goes to other issues in terms of human nature, in terms of license and agency and choice, and what happens when someone tries to take that from us. And I would say, we spoke once in our other podcast, Rabbis Out of the Box, about Hashem, about God's decision to create a world which allowed for choice and license, and it seems to me almost heretical, the fact that those of us who choose to serve Him might assume that it's our role to remove license and choice from people. So I think that I think there's also an obsession of fundamentalist Orthodox positions, which has a heretical level to it. As if God is sitting in heaven wringing His hands and saying, "Oh my God, what are we going to do? The Reformim are coming. The Reforming."
Yeah, we've heard that cry before.
The sense, the obsession that if we don't maintain control, everything will go wrong, and the willingness to almost justify any ends for that means of maintaining absolute control, I believe rests on a very deep lack of belief in God. And so therefore my vision is not a vision of a separation of religion and state, but it is a vision of a separation of halakha and state. In other words, I think it's clear that Israel's founding fathers intended it to be a Jewish state, and in that respect, that's not only culture. In other words, there's certainly the cultural side of that, which is language, and which is history, and which is vision,
calendar,
well, when you start to say calendar, I think you're not only speaking about culture, you are speaking about religion. In other words, for the holidays, for the holidays which have religious roots, to be definitive public holidays, I think is definitely part of my vision for Israel, and I think has an overwhelmingly definitive common denominator in the Israeli populace. I think everyone would agree on that, or almost everyone would agree on that. The question is that not which holidays are official state holidays, but how are they celebrated? Does one have the license and the agency and the freedom? In other words, are we willing to say that Passover is a holiday of freedom, and we will also grant the freedoms that we don't agree on? For instance, to eat chametz on Pesach.
Right.
Now it's clear to me that this should be in everyone's interest, because it's also clear to me that that the law which prohibited eating chametz on Pesach in Israel was the beginning of the trend of restaurants selling chametz on Pesach in Israel. In other words, had that law never been legislated, there probably would have been more people holding on to that tradition simply because of its cultural, inertia and association. And yet, when you come and say we're not going to let you eat chametz on Israel, that's when I begin to look for the stores that are going to be slipping it under the counter. You could take us straight back to the legalized marijuana conversation.
Yes, and I think it goes to the core, perhaps, of the question that I'm dealing with in the story, which is, what does it mean as a people in our land to wield power? And what I hear you say is that if we look back at our history, it's not for naught that both God and Moshe called us a stiff-necked people. On one hand, there's that cultural momentum. If you let us be in the groove that we've always been in, we're not going to jump it so quickly. But if you try to tell us what to do, so then the Jews are going to pop up and start saying, no, I'm sorry, you can't tell me what to do, even if perhaps it's not what they would have done otherwise.
Absolutely. And that goes to the psychology and nature of Jewish people, but it also goes to belief in God. In other words, if we really believe that there is light in Torah and that there is light in halakha, then perhaps the reason people aren't being drawn to our lifestyle is because what we do is project darkness. And if instead what we would project is trust and faithfulness and honesty and openness and trust in God, then I believe we would all find our way. And honestly, my assumption is always that we also have what to learn. That there is that whatever it's supposed to look like in the end. I don't assume that it's that redemption will be here when everybody finally figures out that the way I think is the right way to think. We have a lot to learn from each other, and that dynamic will happen when we begin to trust the process.
So, it's a beautiful note to end on, that essentially trust in God finds its expression in trust in each other. So before we wrap up, I want to give you an opportunity. If people wanted to reach you and hear more about your initiatives, wanted to be a supporter, how could they do that?
So first of all, you can definitely find Hashgacha Pratit and Aaron Leibowitz on Facebook.
Okay.
And Facebook is a huge channel for us. You can also find us on the web at www.chupot, that's spelled CHUPPOT.org.il. That's our website. We don't yet have an English version. The English version will be going up in a few months. Our Hebrew website just went live last week.
Oh,
and definitely, if you know people who are getting married, who should be exploring this option, and I believe that they should, then you can refer them to us through the website. And if you're interested in supporting us financially, you can also find donation information there.
And if that was just too many letters and numbers, you can always reach out to me because I know where to find Rav Aaron. I'm Rav Mike Foyer. You can find me ravmikefoyer@gmail.com. You can also find me on Facebook. And before we wrap up, I just want to thank a few people. I want to thank all the people who give their hard-earned money to make this show happen, to keep it free and widely available. And I want to invite you to join them. Go right now to ravmikefoyer.com. Up in the right-hand corner, you will see a Be a Patron button. You can click on through to give a little bit of per podcast support. Put your money where your ears are, people, and help make it happen. I want to thank the Land of Israel Network. That's thelandofisrael.com. for creating a platform that allows me to reach such a broad range of so many amazing people. I want to thank the Pardes Institute, where we are actually sitting right now. That's pardes.org.il, for building an institution that brings together Jews of so many flavors and allows me to touch their hearts.